I want to go to Bill Barr right now, the former Attorney General of the United States. Attorney General, as you know, the Supreme Court will be taking up on February 8th the arguments for or against Colorado removing Donald Trump from its ballot. Whatever your personal views, and you've made them very clear, of the former president, you think that is an overreach for states to start doing stuff like that, right?
Well, absolutely. I think last time I was on your show, Neil, I said I thought the Supreme Court would take it up very quickly and smack it down very quickly. Regardless of what I think of Trump and the fact that I oppose his re-nomination, I think he has to be beaten at the ballot box. And these heavy-handed efforts to disenfranchise his supporters, I think, are counterproductive. If anything, they make them stronger.
Obviously, this could address any of these other states that are entertaining doing the same thing. There are others who argue that a conviction, even though none of them are involved in the 14th Amendment, insurrection, all of that, could change the template here. But it wouldn't be before this February 8th hearing anyway. What do you think?
Well, that's right. I don't think, the January 6th trial, I think, will be months later. And it could affect the election just based on the information that comes out and the fact of a conviction. But, I think what's happening here is the effort to take him off the ballot and deny people the choice. And, as I've said before, I think that's untenable as a legal matter. We can't have all the states making their own rules as to what an insurrection is and how much evidence is needed to make a determination that someone is engaged in an insurrection. And under the Constitution, under the 14th Amendment, Section 3, that's not a provision that can be enforced until Congress actually sets up the mechanism. And if anything, recent events show the wisdom of that approach. You need to have Congress spell out how that will be enforced.
It's been 3 years since the insurrection, whatever you want to call it, on Capitol Hill. The FBI just today added 3 more arrests to subjects who had a role in that. So they continue to this day. And many in the Trump camp say these are unfair, these are unwarranted. But the battle goes on. And by and large, the Republican Party itself, certainly those in Congress and those of any political import, seem to side with the president on this. Are you surprised 3 years after the fact that's only grown?
Well, like everything else the left does, they did, I think, go too far. I think there were people involved in January 6th, particularly the people who attacked the police and broke their way into the Capitol. There were people that should have been prosecuted, but I think they cast their net far too broadly and have been hounding people that really, just walked in to open doors in the Capitol and hung around. I think they just took it too far. But that being said, I don't minimize what happened up there. While I don't think it was an insurrection, it clearly was a shameful episode, and some of the people involved should be prosecuted.
What did you think, if you had a chance, sir, to listen to the president's speech, President Biden's speech on this, and making that a focal point to kick off his campaign?
Well, I think it sort of shows what the dynamic of this election is. I don't think, I think that Biden's administration has been a catastrophe, and the only thing they have to run on is Donald Trump. Donald Trump breathes life into the Democratic Party. Now, a lot is made of the fact that he's leading Biden right now, but I think the actual story is it's shocking to me that he's only leading by a couple of points, a very small lead over Biden, despite the fact that it's a catastrophic administration. And you compare that to someone like Nikki Haley, who's leading by 17 points. And
you're talking about over President Biden, not within the Republican Party. You're right, got it. Could I ask you a little bit about that, though? Yeah. Because you had argued, and you've been fairly consistent at this, Attorney General, that a second term of Donald Trump would be awful. It would spell disaster. You would said a number of times that Donald Trump knew well he had lost the election, but continued pursuing this. So what is your biggest fear if he gets back in?
Right. Now, I think the Biden administration would be an unmitigated disaster. My concern about Trump is severalfold. One, I think he has the best chance of losing because he brings out the opposition. I think he will lose the House. I think he will be a lame duck president from the word go. I think his management and leadership style is unduly divisive and chaotic, and he will not be able to accomplish the kinds of things we need to do to have lasting change. All Republicans who are running will block bad regulation and stop bad things from happening, but that's not enough. We need some changes going forward. We need control of Congress, and he will not deliver that. I think the other candidates would come in. There would not be lame ducks. They would have the support of Congress, and they would be able to be more adept as executives accomplishing what has to be accomplished.
You know, sir, every time we talk about how we're going to be talking about you, we get a lot of comments from a lot of Trump loyalists. You might be surprised, maybe probably would not be surprised. But there are some who are saying that the former president is already violating, or at least testing, this federal gag order by making comments, as he has about you, among other things, saying that you were a coward when you were in office and you didn't fight hard enough for the issue of the election and everything else. I know you've been dealing with this type of thing, the back and forth, a lot, and among his supporters, a lot. But what do you think of that?
Whether he's violating the gag order?
That he's violating the gag order and that he makes you the focus of violating it.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't, calling me a coward, it doesn't really affect things. I don't really consider it a violation of the gag order. I mean, if he was threatening or something like that, that might be a different story. But I just dismiss what he has to say. But I think, the gag order is in a sensitive area. You have a candidate in a political race who's running, and he should be able to speak freely, and he should also be able to attack the charges against him. And just where to draw the line, I think, is delicate. And, if he threatens witnesses or things like that, it's a different story. But just calling people names, I don't think it's that significant.
So in a gag order, just to understand the details, because I'm not a lawyer, but although I've watched a lot of legal shows, Attorney General, so I think I qualify. But I do wonder what you make of constantly going after the people who attack him. Well, it technically, I guess, isn't a violation of gag order. Is it intimidating? Are you ever intimidated by that? Do you fear that others are intimidated by it and might hold back?
No, I'm not intimidated, but there may be some others that will be. I think more than what he has to say is, I think some Republicans are calculating that the chances are good that he'd be president again, and I think they're worried about offending him.
Got it, Attorney General. I wish we had more time, but thank you for taking the time, Evan. Very good seeing you.
Thanks, Neil.
I'm Steve Ducey.
I'm Brian Kilmeade.
And I'm Ainsley Earhart. And click here to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page to catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis.